Hi all, and welcome back to another edition of the Millennial Cynic with me, Sarah. I hope you are all keeping well. Today I want to talk about a huge issue facing us all, and it's a huge issue that can be quite divisive at times. Climate change, or more accurately, the best way to combat climate change. Now this has been in the news a lot here recently in Ireland, with an agreement of sorts finally reached to reduce carbon emissions by our agricultural sector by 25%. Not the red line 30% the Greens wanted, or the red line 22% the rest wanted, but there we go. Funnily enough, neither red line appeared to be fully read by the end, as all parties remained in government, despite the tedious game of chicken we all had to endure in the run-up to it. So let's take a little look back in time before we get to today's problems, shall we? Okay, so Millennial Cynic here, which obviously means I'm in my which obviously means I'm a 90s kid. Yes, that's the one. Anyway, I'm a millennial. The 90s was my childhood. And even back then, climate change was a very real issue that even us kids knew about. Now, it wasn't called climate change then, of course. It was all about greenhouse gases, smog, pollution, CFCs, and the hole in the ozone layer. Later, it was renamed to global warming before changing once again to climate change. I remember colouring competitions and art projects in school about smog, littering and saving the planet by recycling. I remember being taught about the smoky coal ban, for example, that came into effect in 1990 here in Ireland. David Attenborough documentaries were all the rage and were watched, and I hope are still watched, by children all around the world. But his message even then was that it was our duty to protect the natural world. Captain Planet was a fairly big cartoon with a strong message that echoed this. We must protect our planet and bring pollution down to zero and fight on the planet's side. God, that intro is catchy as hell, and I'm sure is embedded in the minds of so many millennials, much like it will be embedded in mine for the rest of the day. But this was the 90s. Even then, we knew that pollution had to stop. And isn't that what climate action is all about? Stopping pollution? Pollution from carbon emissions? Pollution from waste ending up in our oceans and destroying whole ecosystems? And yet, look where we are now. Still polluting, still destroying, still plundering the natural world. But the difference now is we can't pretend it's not happening. We can't pretend human action has not sped this up. Another big difference is ordinary people are now being asked to pay for it. And this is the divisive issue. Who pays for it? I mean, of course, we'll all pay for it eventually. In one way, shape or form, we'll all pay. But the financial burden being placed on ordinary people is, I feel, too much, and will not win hearts and minds. Public buy-in is absolutely hugely important in this fight, but I just don't think the buy-in is fully there right now. Why? Because people are tired. People are tired of being blamed for everything. People are tired of panic and hysteria. And people are tired of the constant attacks on our wallets and bank balances. People are becoming cynical. Jumping from one crisis to another, to another, to another has worn people down. Apathy is on the rise because when everything is a crisis, nothing is. And unfortunately, climate action is not endearing itself to the ordinary Joe Soap, who just wants a period of respite and calm from the ills of the world. Because climate action calls for Joe Soap to pay for more than his fair share. It's hard to feel like you're making a difference in the world when you do all you can and are still asked to pay more. When the big polluters, big business and countries like China, USA, India and Brazil, to name a few, are still causing such major issues and seemingly getting away with it. The carbon footprint was a term coined by BP. Yes, that's right, that BP, the one that caused that massive oil spill. Back in 2005, they came up with the phrase to try and rehab their own image, and to try to shift the onus and guilt onto ordinary consumers. And while there is no doubt that the collective actions of the many can cause issues, and we should all be aware of our carbon footprint and try to minimise it, big companies like BP also need to take ownership of their carbon footprint and strive to reduce it. The countries I mentioned previously also need to step up and do the same. Until they do, and until ordinary people see the culture shift for themselves, public buy-in will remain the remit of those virtuous few who can actually afford it, and those who are forced into it by taxes and disincentives, whether they can afford it or not. And just this week, we saw BP lauding massive profits of $8.5 billion for the second quarter of the year. That's right, for 3 months. Alongside other companies like Shell and British gas owner Centrica, also posting huge profits. We've seen wind farms here in Ireland making huge gains too. These obscene profits for these giant energy companies, coming at a time when we the consumer are paying more than ever for oil and gas, are a kick in the face to ordinary people. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that the priority for those profits is putting them back into the pockets of the shareholders, rather than investing in renewables like they said they would, which is what needs to happen, and it's what they have a social, ethical and moral obligation to do. Capitalism is a great thing when it works, but it only works when it's not left to run amok, unfettered and uncontrolled. Capitalism absolutely drives innovation and progress, but sometimes it needs to be pointed in the right direction. And this is where the big governments of the world need to act. There needs to be incentives granted to energy companies to innovate real green and renewable alternatives, with windfall taxes galore when they don't, and when they reap the rewards of an energy crisis. Companies like this making record profits does not seem to me like there's an energy crisis, by the way. It screams of a manufactured crisis to allow for profiteering. Yet again, unfettered, unregulated capitalism at work. And this is an area where little old Ireland can actually be a world leader, the world leader it seemingly wants to be. Offer incentives for big businesses to come up with real green and eco-friendly solutions to the problems we face. Offer greater funding to our colleges and universities to research and innovate solutions that work, rather than simply picking a figure for carbon reduction and forcing it on the likes of our farmers. Farming is a vital part of living. We need to protect it. We also need to be self-sufficient. Can we make it greener and more eco-friendly? Absolutely. But this should be done with, and no pun intended here, more carrot and less stick. Do we, Ireland, produce more beef, for example, than we need? Yes we do. Do we export most of it? Again, yes we do. But if we exported our beef to other EU nations, then surely the carbon footprint of that is less than the carbon footprint of importing beef into Europe from South America, halfway around the world. Beef, which we, the EU, are more than capable of producing ourselves. Does this part of the Mercosur deal make any sense to anyone else? Now, I can understand there is more to this trade deal than just beef, but in a world where climate change is now the big ticket item, why are the EU happy to import beef from halfway around the world and cut back on our own farming? This doesn't make a lick of sense to me. The carbon footprint from Irish beef landing on a shelf in a shop in, say, France or Germany is far less than that of beef coming from South America, doubly so when you take into account the ongoing destruction of the Amazon rainforest to make way for increasing cattle herds. Yet another issue that I've been hearing about since I was a kid in the 90s. And just another issue that nothing has been done about. So we can reduce our herd all we like, and sure, maybe we should be looking to reduce our herd anyway. But let's not pretend that any reduction we make won't be made up for a few times over in South America. Let's not pretend that it will do anything other than artificially lower Ireland's carbon footprint, while really it is a net gain in carbon to the world. Now, I'm obviously not an expert here, but this seems pretty straightforward to me. Should we, Ireland, cut back on our herd anyway? Possibly. Probably even. If we are oversupplying other countries and adding to food waste, then yes, absolutely we should. But we need to remain self-sufficient and encourage farmers into more eco-friendly practices. We cannot pretend agriculture is a choice. It is a necessity of life, and one that needs protecting. And the agri-food industry is a cornerstone of Ireland's economy. Another issue I have is recycling, or rather the actual recycling process itself. Recycling is a huge aspect of climate action. All those plastics, single-use or otherwise, cannot be left to pollute our waters and land. The hugely damaging effect plastic waste has on wildlife has been well documented. It is a blight on the natural world, so naturally, recycling is the way forward. I know I, for one, am very thorough about making sure our household waste is properly disposed of into the correct bins. I diligently separate and clean plastics before throwing them into the green bin. The benefits being that I'm doing my part, and I have to put out the black bin for general waste less often. But am I really doing my part? It really doesn't seem so when news surfaced during the summer of 2020 of a study by researchers at NUI Galway and at the University of Limerick that found that close to a third of plastic exported from the European Union to Asia for recycling is not recycled at all, with most of it going into landfills or ending up in the ocean. So even when you are doing your part, big business isn't doing its part, and so you'd be forgiven for feeling like you needn't have bothered at all. It grates even more when waste companies have now changed their pricing models to charge you for recyclable waste, when in the past that service was free to encourage people to do it. We can also take a look at electric vehicles. On paper, these seem like a great way to reduce emissions. Unfortunately, they are still too pricey for most ordinary people who may be focusing their savings on a deposit for, say, a home rather than a new car. But it also begs the question, how are we charging these vehicles? In Ireland last year, in 2021, gas generated 46% of Ireland's electricity, with coal generating 11%, while renewable energy generated by wind fell from 35% in 2020 to just 29% in 2021. So unfortunately, we are using fossil fuels to charge our electric vehicles. Of course, this can change, and moving away from a dependence on gas is something that we should be working towards. We should be striving for a greater emphasis on renewable energy production here in Ireland. We should be looking at other countries who have successfully harnessed the various forms of renewable energy available to them and work towards a tailored solution for Ireland. We may always need gas to make up a shortfall, but we do absolutely need to move away from needing gas and fossil fuels for the majority of our energy production. And the further we move from a reliance on fossil fuels, the more eco-friendly electric vehicles become. But again, this is not something ordinary Joe or Joanne Soap can do anything about. We are at the mercy of those bigger than us to move in the right direction. We need the big energy companies who've had bumper profits to step up and do their part. We need other countries to move away from their dependence on gas and coal for energy generation. When we look at the issues I've just raised, like BP and their bumper profits, like farming being outsourced, like recycling not actually being recycled and instead dumped, like expensive electric vehicles who are still ultimately powered by fossil fuels, it's not hard to see why there might be a difficulty in getting the public to buy in to climate action. Of course, there are many climate change deniers out there, but most people would like to see a healthier world. After all, this planet will survive just fine long after we've made it uninhabitable for ourselves. But the problem that I see for most ordinary people is that a lot of the action we are seeing just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unless you follow the money, of course. And this is where the problems lie. I am a millennial. I and others like me and younger are being asked to pay for something that should have been tackled years ago, on top of everything else we're being gouged for. I am a renter in a housing and rental crisis. I cannot pick a home to rent based on how eco-friendly it is. I have to pick a rental based on how wallet-friendly it is. I cannot demand my landlord retrofits the apartment that I'm lucky enough to be renting in the first place with solar panels and better insulation. Not all homeowners can afford to do this either, and until the government steps up with, at the bare minimum, interest-free loans to do it, the uptake will remain at a trickle. I cannot drive an electric vehicle because they are still too expensive for me, in a cost of living crisis no less, and there's nowhere for me to charge a car like that. Again, renting an apartment. So I remain with a steady diesel car that has emissions under the NCT limit and is serviced regularly and used as little as possible. I should not be made to feel guilty about this. I recycle as much as I can, but have no control over where it ends up. I am gouged at the pumps and in my home energy bills because of companies profiteering and reaping the rewards. I make sure to turn off electronic devices when I'm not using them. I don't leave things on standby. I don't leave lights on, and I use energy-efficient LED lights. I do everything I can to reduce energy wastage, and yet even still, my last bill was eye-watering. I can't help but feel angry at being punished for using the only systems available to me. That just seems ridiculous. And on that note, these systems that we are trying to overhaul, systems that we are trying to move away from and into more eco-friendly and renewable systems, that's all fantastic. But here's the problem. We can't just take something away without having something ready to go to replace it. For example, if we reduce our gas imports and then have a calm winter with no wind to generate the shortfall, then we are up the creek. Rolling power cuts will suddenly become a very real concern, as opposed to the scaremongering they're seen as today. We need a more sensible transition from these fossil fuels. I understand that the faster we do this, the better, but unfortunately you cannot get blood from a stone. We need to heat our homes. We need electricity. The powers that be have ignored the warnings for at least the last 3 decades that I've been alive. Now is the time to direct innovation in the right areas and hope something works. But the entire world needs to get on the same page. There is 0 point in Ireland becoming net zero, ignoring the real costs to the citizens of the country, while big business and the big countries continue on their merry way. There is 0 point in the EU reducing our carbon footprint, only to redistribute that same footprint and more elsewhere, as seen with the importation of beef from South America. That's just playing Tetris with the emissions and not actually reducing them globally. For full public buy-in, we need full corporate buy-in. We need the polluters of the world to change their ways. We need the big energy companies to do what needs to be done or face massive taxes and disincentives. We need the world powers to lead by example, and we need to stop placing the financial burden of climate action on ordinary people. Thank you for listening to my musings on this very divisive issue, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more from me. You can also follow me on Twitter for my real-time reactions to the news of the day. I hope to be back soon with another video, so until then, slán go fóill.